so-called Jefferson Bible. What he claimed he was attempting to do, and he wrote about extensively, in hacking the Bible into pieces and then taping it back together to form his own cursed version of Scripture, was to separate the true sayings of Jesus from the things he believed had been added to the gospel accounts. For example, in a letter to John Adams, he wrote, quote, "In the New Testament, there is internal evidence that parts of it have proceeded from an extraordinary man, and that other parts are of the fabric of very inferior minds. It is as easy to separate those parts as to pick out diamonds from dunghills," end quote. When one reads the Jefferson Bible, it becomes clear what Jefferson was referring to when he mentioned dunghills that needed to be removed from Scripture. He specifically took a pair of scissors and a razor blade, and he cut out evidence of the divinity of Jesus, of the messianic assignment of Jesus, including the virgin birth, the miracles of Christ, the Lord's resurrection, his ascension into heaven, and so on. And because it details his second coming and arrival of Antichrist, the entire book of Revelation was omitted. These were among the things Jefferson believed came from inferior minds, forming dunghills. Concerning the Lord Jesus himself, Jefferson wrote in another letter on April 13, 1920, quote, "Among the sayings and discourses imputed to him by his biographers, that is, the authors of the Bible, I find many passages of fine imagination, correct morality, and of the most lovely benevolence, and others, again, of so much ignorance, so much absurdity, so much untruth, charlatanism, and imposture, that I separate, therefore, the gold from the dross, and leave the latter to the stupidity of some, and roguery of others of his disciples. Of this band of dupes and impostors, Paul," talking about the Apostle Paul, "was the first corrupter of the doctrines of Jesus," end quote. So that was the second member who would guide the design of the Great Seal of the United States. And then there was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most influential founding fathers. He was, without question, deeply involved in Freemasonry and in other secret societies. He belonged to secret groups in 3 countries involved in the War of Independence: America, France, and England. He was master of the Masonic Lodge of Philadelphia. While over in France, he was master of the Nine Sisters Lodge, from which sprang the French Revolution, which was significantly anti-God. In England, he joined a rockish political group founded by Sir Francis Dashwood, known as the Hellfire Club. This 18th century group is described as follows, quote, "The Hellfire Club was an exclusive English club that met sporadically during the mid-18th century. Its purpose at best was to mock traditional religion and to conduct orgies. At worst, it involved the indulgence of satanic rites and sacrifices. The club to which Franklin belonged was established by Francis Dashwood, a member of Parliament and friend of Franklin. The club, which consisted of the Superior Order of 12 members, took part in basic forms of satanic worship. In addition to taking part in the occult, orgies and parties with prostitutes were also said to be the norm," end quote. It might have been a lot darker than that. On February 11, 1998, the Sunday Times out of England reported that 10 bodies were dug up from beneath Benjamin Franklin's home at 36 Craven Street in London. The bodies were of 4 adults and 6 children. They were discovered during a costly renovation of Franklin's former home. The Times reported, quote, "Initial estimates are that the bones are about 200 years old and were buried at the time Franklin was living in the house, which was his home from 1757 to 1762 and from 1764 to 1775. Most of the bones show signs of having been dissected, sawn, or cut. One skull has been drilled with several holes." end quote. Later reports from the Benjamin Franklin house reveal that not only were human remains found, but animal remains as well, that appear to be blackened or charred as if by fire and then hidden beneath the floorboards of the home. Needless to say, the evidence has caused a number of researchers to suggest that Franklin's involvement with the Hellfire Club may have been connected with Satanists performing ritual killings of both humans and animals. With that brief history of the men designated to design the Great Seal in mind, it's important to note that besides Benjamin Franklin, as many as 44 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were also Freemasons. Numerous U.S. presidents were part of the craft as well, including Washington, Monroe, Jackson, Polk, Buchanan, A. Johnson, Garfield, McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Harding, F. Roosevelt, Truman, L.B. Johnson, Ford, and numerous others. Not to mention those in the order such as Paul Revere, Edmund Burke, John Hancock, and so many more. Besides the Great Seal, the question, though, of whether the Order of Freemasons engineered the entire United States city named after America's first president, according to an occult grand design, is something that I want to talk about. It's definitely something that a growing body of historians and researchers are admitting. For instance, David Oveson, who became a Mason after writing The Secret Architect of Our Nation's Capital, The Masons and the Building of Washington, D.C., he argues effectively that the city's layout intentionally incorporated the esoteric belief system of Freemasonry, especially as it involved astrologically aligning the capital with the constellation Virgo or Isis. In 1793, when George Washington sanctioned the laying of the Capitol building's cornerstone, he did that while wearing a Masonic apron emblazoned with the Brotherhood's symbols. For occult expert Manly P. Hall, that made perfect sense. Was Francis Bacon's vision of the New Atlantis a prophetic dream of the great civilization which was so certain to rise upon the soil of the New World, he asked in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages? It cannot be doubted, he said, that the secret societies conspired to establish such upon the American continent. Hall's New Atlantis reference was based on a utopian scheme that the European secret societies of the 16 and 1700s were literally infatuated with, wherein an occult democracy would be established based on men participating with ancient Greco-Roman gods to earn their favor, their protection, their power in the establishment of a government dedicated to their second coming at the dawn of a new golden age. That's why all of this is on the Great Seal. It's why the city is laid out the way it is. Now, Hall continued that historical incidents in the early development of the United States clearly bore, quote, the influence of that secret body which has so long guided the destinies of people and religions. By them, nations are created as vehicles for the promulgation of ideas. And while nations are true to these ideals, they survive. When they vary from them, they vanish, like the Atlantis of old, which had ceased to know the gods, end quote. Involvement by Freemasons for the development of early America as the New Atlantis is clearly viewed from the Great Seal all the way over to the symbolic layout of Washington, D.C., as the capital for this new Atlantis. And in fact, that's been so well documented over the last few decades that even Masons today have ceased denying the affiliation. And in fact, daily Masonic tours through services devoted to that history are now offered of the city's landmarks to illustrate the connection, literally for a fee. A guide will help you visit locations such as the George Washington Masonic National Memorial or the House of the Temple, the headquarters of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The House of the Temple, I've been there numerous times. I've met with 33-degree Freemasons there, asked many questions that are in numerous of my books. Designed in 1911, the House of the Temple hosts the Freemason Hall of Fame, an enormous collection of Freemason memorabilia, including various artworks important to the Masons, a library of 250,000 books, which I've gone through, and more importantly is the location for the Rite's Supreme Council 33rd degree meetings. When you leave the building, you can exit the House of the Temple, walk down the street, and take pictures of the enormous Masonic obelisk, the phallic Egyptian symbol of fertility in the distance known as the Washington Monument, which I will discuss here in a few moments. But for obvious reasons, while modern Masons may openly admit these days to involvement by their Jacobite ancestors toward establishing the foundation for a utopian New World Order in Washington, D.C., most vigorously deny that the talisman-like layout of the streets, government buildings, and Masonic monuments were actually meant for what researcher David Bay calls, quote, an electric type grid that pulsates with luciferic power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, end quote. Notwithstanding that denial, the government's own records explain otherwise, clearly stating that the capital city design was indeed shepherded by those who wanted it to reflect dedication to the pagan gods. For instance, the article that anybody can Google and read, called The Most Approved Plan, the Competition for the Capitol's Design. You can find that on the Library of Congress's own website. And it tells how, after advertising a competition for the design of Government Center in D.C., George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the commissioners of the District of Columbia were disappointed by the entries, and a design based on, quote, the Roman Pantheon, the circular domed rotunda dedicated to all pagan gods, was suggested by Jefferson, who later shepherded it through several transformations in order to accomplish the end goal. Now, Freemason David Oveson adds that when the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol building was laid, it was actually done through Masonic rituals meant to procure approval of these pagan gods. As recorded in 2 bronze panels on the Senate doors of the Capitol, George Washington is seen standing in front of a Mason who holds 2 versions of the Masonic square, while he himself uses a Masonic trowel on the cornerstone. It is the apron that Washington so famously wore that day that bears specific Masonic symbolism, which Oveson explains as designed to, quote, please the invisible agencies who watched over the event. Undoubtedly, invisible agencies were present at the cornerstone ceremony, he says, but they were made visible in the apron's symbolism, the radiant eye, representing the invisible presence of the great architect, the high spiritual being who had been invited by prayer and ritual to oversee the ceremonial. The radiant eye was the sun eye, or spiritual sun, of Horus, Osiris, Apollo. The United States, therefore, cast on the Great Seal and within the layout of the Capitol building, all of this reflects the secret society's scheme to fulfill the Baconian dream of a new Atlantis by establishing America as the capital of the New World Order. Hall continued, quote, here on the Great Seal is represented the Great Pyramid of Giza, composed of 13 rows of masonry, showing 72 stones. The pyramid is without a capstone, and above its upper platform floats a triangle containing the all-seeing eye, surrounded by rays of light. The combination of the pyramid and the all-seeing eye is more than chance or coincidence. There is nothing about the early struggles of the colonists to suggest such a selection of farmers, shoekeepers, and country gentlemen were behind the design. There's only one possible origin for these symbols, and that is the secret societies, which came to this country 150 years before the Revolutionary War. Most of the patriots who achieved American independence belonged to these societies and derived their inspiration, courage, and high purpose from the ancient teachings. There can be no question that the Great Seal was directly inspired by these orders of the human quest, and that it has set forth the purpose for this nation as that purpose was seen and known to the founding fathers. The monogram of the New Atlantis reveals this continent as set apart for the accomplishment of the great work. Here is to arise the pyramid of human aspiration, the school of the secret sciences, end quote. Besides Manly Hall, other late scholars who also recognized the occult symbolism of the Great Seal as pointing to this secret destiny of America included famous people like Rhodes Scholar James H. Billington, Harvard professor Charles Eliot Norton, who described the Great Seal as hardly other than an emblem of a Masonic fraternity. And in 1846, 33rd degree Freemason and noted author James D. Carter inadvertently confirmed that as well when he admitted that the Masonic symbolism is clearly known whenever, quote, an informed Mason examines the Great Seal, end quote. And yet, for all the volumes written in the early years about the arcane meaning behind the symbols and mottos of the Great Seal, it was not until the 1930s that, perhaps by providence, the significance of the seal started finding its defining moment. It happened when two-term President Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to run for an unprecedented third term, and he chose as his running mate for the vice presidency Secretary of Agriculture and 32nd degree Mason Henry Wallace. Both men were mystically minded 32nd degree Freemasons and saw in the Great Seal what they called a Masonic prophecy of a coming New World Order under an exalted U.S. president. Both men were also devotees of Agni Yogi Society founder and theosophist Nicholas Roerich, who had migrated from the Soviet Union to the United States. And in the 1920s and 30s, he made a name for himself on the New York scene as a teacher of Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Secret Doctrine. Roerich's particular devotion, however, to mysticism was increasingly focused on apocalyptic themes surrounding the coming of a new earthly order that would be born out of chaos. And that struck a chord with Wallace in particular. All of this came to light later when Henry Wallace began the VP race and was actually threatened by embarrassment from the Republicans who had come into possession of a series of letters written by Wallace in the 1930s. Some of those communications were addressed to Roerich as Dear Guru, and they described the anticipation that Wallace felt for what he called the breaking of the new day, a time when a mythical kingdom would arrive on Earth, accompanied by a special breed of people. Although Roosevelt would be the one to set in motion the push to place the Great Seal of the United States on the U.S. $1 bill, it was Wallace who actually claimed it was he who first brought the seal's oracular significance to Roosevelt in the 1930s, believing that the symbolism of the emblems carried reference to Roosevelt's New Deal, and more important, the Masonic prophecy toward a new world order. Wallace describes this meeting that he had with Roosevelt. Quote, Roosevelt, as he looked at the colored reproduction of the seal, was first struck with the representation of the all-seeing eye, a Masonic representation of the great architect of the universe. Next, he was impressed with the idea that the foundation for the new order of the ages had been laid in 1776, but that it would be completed only under the eye of the great architect. Roosevelt, like myself, was a 32nd degree Mason, and he suggested that the seal be put on the dollar bill. And then he took the matter up with the Secretary of Treasury, who was also a Freemason, and brought it up in a cabinet meeting and asked James Farley, who was the Postmaster General and a Roman Catholic, if he thought the Catholics would have any objection to the all-seeing eye, which he, as a Mason, looked on as a Masonic symbol of deity. And Farley said, no, there would be no objection, end quote. Regardless of who, between Roosevelt and Wallace, first perceived the seal's Masonic prophetic significance, surviving records clearly show that it was Roosevelt, and in his own handwriting no less, who instructed that the front side of the seal be placed on the right back of the dollar, and the reverse side of the seal, with the pyramid and all-seeing eye, be put on the left side, so that it would be the first thing that people saw when reading the back of the dollar bill from left to right. Therefore, most Americans were left with the impression that the mysterious pyramid and its heralding of a new order under the coming of a god were the foremost symbols of the American Republic. Wallace and Roosevelt viewed this all-seeing eye above the unfinished pyramid as pointing to the return or the reincarnation of the coming savior of Masonry, referenced in the mottos Anavet Coeptis and Novus Ordo Seclorum, whose arrival would cap the pyramid and then launch the New World Order. The all-seeing eye on the Great Seal is fashioned after the Eye of Horus, the offspring of Osiris, or Osiris resurrected, as both of these men understood. But Aleister Crowley, who was also a 33rd degree Freemason, who called himself the wickedest man on earth, the Antichrist 666 and all that, he was a Roerich occult contemporary. And he often spoke of this as the new age of Horus being reflected on the Great Seal, and the breaking dawn of the rebirth of Osiris. That such mystics and Freemasons simultaneously used such identical language is telling, given what I pointed out earlier, that the Great Seal's mottos and symbolism relate to both Osiris and Apollo specifically and yet as one. Osiris is the dominant theme of the Egyptian symbols, his resurrection and return, while the mottos of the seal point directly to Apollo, and the eagle, a pagan emblem of Jupiter, to Apollo's father. This prophecy begins in symbolism on the front side of the Great Seal with the symbol of Jupiter, a bald eagle, who clutches a bundle of arrows in his left talon, while its right claw grips an olive branch. Besides the origin of the Latin mottos on the Great Seal being derived from Apollonian prophecies, forecasting the second coming of this Apollo Osiris under the usurper Jupiter-Saturn in a final occult world order, the symbols on the Great Seal confirm the secret destiny of America and the desire of especially Thomas Jefferson to accommodate the magical entry of these entities at the start of what I would call the Great Tribulation period. And again, I've gone out on a limb, and I am pointing to the year 2025 as potentially the start date of that event. When you look at the front side of the Great Seal, you're stricken with the redundancy of the number 13's uses. 13 bars and stripes in the shield, 13 arrows, 13 leaves in the olive branch, and so on. Now that pattern continues on the reverse side with 13 levels in the uncapped pyramid, 13 letters of Anavet Coeptis, and so on. Albert Pike, in his famous book Morals and Dogma, revealed that Freemasonry's two sets of meanings exist behind these symbols. In this case, the superficial translation for blue degree Masons and the profane, that's you and me, which assert that the number 13 refers to the original 13 colonies or states. However, what Pike also revealed is that the deeper meaning, understood by 33rd degree Masonry, is that the mystical number 13 actually reflects those parts of Osiris that Isis was able to find after he was murdered by his evil brother Set. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The same is true with the phrase in the banner E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many, one, which laity and 32nd lower blue masonry degrees are told refers to the many ethnicities that came together to form one nation, while high degree occultists acknowledge that the true meaning of E pluribus unum echoes the God of many names, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo, Nimrod, as the singular entity prophesied on the Great Seal to rule the world at the end of time. That's clearly understood whenever high-degree occultists and master Freemasons observe the bald eagle, the ancient icon of the god Jupiter, whose prophesied return is captioned in the phrase Anahuac Coeptus on the reverse side of the seal, with the 13 stars forming a hexagram above his head. For example, 33rd degree Freemason and occultist Aleister Crowley, who claimed that the incorporeal entity Awas elected him to be the prophet that would lead the world into the age of Horus, the second coming of Osiris Apollo, he employed the same symbols of an eagle and a hexagram above its head as a talisman to summon the second coming of Jupiter. And then there's the accompanying layout of Washington, D.C. itself. David Oveson, who I mentioned earlier, whose works have been widely endorsed by Freemasons, including the top-level Freemasons in Washington, D.C., and also endorsed by Robert Hieronymus, considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the Great Seal. His works have been called, quote, exceptionally well referenced, and adds that the dedication of buildings such as the U.S. Capitol building, Cornerstone, had to be done at certain astrological times related to the zodiacal constellation Virgo or Isis, while Jupiter was rising in Scorpio because, quote, the Cornerstone ceremonial was designed not only to gain the approval of the spiritual beings, but also had to ensure that these were content that the building was being brought into the world at the right time, end quote. Oveson later stated more directly, quote, whoever arranged for Virgo to be so consistently operative during foundation and cornerstone ceremonies must have been alert to the fact that they were inviting some archetype or spiritual being to direct the destiny of the city, end quote. Finally, Oveson hints who the spiritual being governing the capital of the United States and directing our destiny is when he said, quote, a medieval esotericist would have said that Washington, D.C. was governed by the intelligency Hamalel, the spiritual entity which ruled Virgo and which worked hand in hand with Mercury, end quote. Hamalel, folks, is an evil adversary of the cherubim of God, serving under Lilith, whose devotees gather annually with U.S. presidents and other global dignitary to honor her at the Bohemian Grove. As a result of this alignment of the Capitol buildings and streets in Washington, D.C. with this constellation, every August 10, an astrological event reoccurs in the sky above Washington, tying the city to the pagan Virgo, known in ancient Egypt as the goddess Isis. Quote, at dusk, as golden light turns brick facades a dusty rose, the shimmering sun floats a few degrees just to the left of Pennsylvania Avenue, gradually including to the right until it sets directly over the famous street, says Julie Duen. If the horizon remains cloudless, 3 stars are visible in a straight line from the Capitol of the White House to the skies in the west, known as Regulus, Arcturus, and Spica. The stars form a right-angled triangle framing the constellation of Virgo, end quote. Folks, such mysticism incorporated into the design of Washington, D.C. by Freemasons for summoning the timing, presence, and approval of these invisible agents was a formula actually perfected in pagan Rome, the gods of whom Thomas Jefferson insisted Washington, D.C. be in dedication to. John Fellows explains why this is true. Quote, "They consulted the gods to know if the enterprise would be acceptable to them, and if they approved of the day chosen to begin the work. They invoked, besides the gods of the country, the gods to whose protection the new city was recommending, which was done secretly because it was necessary that the tutelary gods should be unknown to the vulgar." It may come as little surprise then that when George W. Bush, in a speech the day before his second inaugural, said that the United States had, quote, "a calling from beyond the stars," end quote, which is, by the way, a disturbing statement taken directly from the satanic Necronomicon fiction concerning alien creator gods, that the Capitol building had been intentionally set in the head of a Masonic owl figure, which in turn stands atop the White House, located on the chin of the pentagrammic goat of Mendes. The upside-down pentagram, or Baphomet, clearly visible in the DC street layout, represents the goat's head, and it's considered the most powerful symbol in Satanism, while the owl figure is a well-known representative of the Masonic, Illuminati, Bohemian, Owl of Wisdom incarnation of Athena, Minerva, Lilith, and Hecate. Occultists around the world understand the power of these DC symbols and rituals, and they realize that they are not only for conveying psychological concepts, but are there actually to coerce the mysterious and potent supernaturalism invited to take residence there. That is a belief system that is deeply preserved in all of the mystery school, Masonic, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Kabbalistic symbolism that is and remains a part of modern Masonic history. According to famous Freemason Foster Bailey, those symbols intentionally hide, quote, "a secret which veils mysterious forces. These energies, when released, can have a potent effect," end quote. Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle once famously added, quote, "By symbols, accordingly, is man guided and commanded, made happy, made wretched," end quote. As previously pointed out, Masons are, as a result, under oath, never to reveal the true meaning of their symbols, and when somehow they are compelled to offer explanation, they falsify the statement, even to lower degree Masons. Substantial reasons exist for why the designers of Washington's Government Center would have wanted to likewise obscure the meaning behind the occultic layout of America's capital. If the public in general had been prematurely convinced of the end game prophesied in the DC symbolism, it would have been beyond the acceptance of prior generations, who likely would have demanded change in leaders and facilities. But as time moved forward, and increasingly it has become necessary for public understanding of America's heritage and secret destiny and intended purpose, little by little, either by providence, promotion, or even resistance, a clearer picture has emerged of what Manly P. Hall called the secret destiny of America. Now, as I've written in several books, the vast majority of people, when looking at Washington, D.C. and at the Vatican, never comprehend how these cities actually constitute one of the greatest open conspiracies of all time. In both cities, reproduced in all their glory and right before the world's eyes, is an ancient talismanic diagram based on the history and the cult of Isis, Osiris and Horus, including the magical utilities meant to generate the deity's return. It's a primeval concept, especially that of domes facing obelisk. This was designed in antiquity for the express purpose of regeneration, resurrection, and apotheosis, for deity incarnation, from the underworld to the earth's surface through union of the respective figures, the dome, which is the ancient structural representation of the womb of Isis, and the obelisk, which is the ancient representation of the erect male phallus of Osiris. That layout, as modeled in antiquity, exists today on the grandest scale at the heart of the capital of the most powerful government on earth, the United States, as well as in the heart of the most politically influential church on earth, the Vatican. Now, given this fact and the pattern provided by the Apostle Paul in the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, that the end times would culminate in a marriage between political, that is Antichrist, and religious, that is false prophet, authorities at the return of Osiris Apollo, it behooves open-minded researchers to carefully consider these prophecies in stone, as it defines the spiritual energy that's knowingly or unknowingly being invoked at both locations, with potential ramifications for the year 2025 and beyond. The U.S. Capitol has been called the Mirror Vatican due to the strikingly similar layout and design of its primary buildings and streets. And that's no accident. In fact, America's forefathers first named the capital city Rome. But the parallelism between Washington and the Vatican is most clearly illustrated by the Capitol building and dome facing the obelisk known as the Washington Monument, and at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican by a similar dome facing a familiar obelisk, both of which were, according to their own official records, fashioned after the Roman pantheon, the circular domed rotunda dedicated to all pagan gods. That layout, a domed temple facing an obelisk, is an ancient alchemical blueprint that holds significant esoteric meaning. And for those that may not know, the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is historically based on a pagan Masonic temple. Thomas Jefferson, who shepherded the anti-Christian Roman Pantheon design, wrote to the Capitol's architect, Benjamin Latrobe, defining it as, quote, the first temple dedicated to embellishing with Athenian taste the course of a nation looking far beyond the range of Athenian destinies, end quote. The Athenian Empire was first known as Osiria, the kingdom of Osiris. Now, in 1833, Massachusetts Representative Rufus Coyote agreed with that, writing, quote, we have built no national temples but the Capitol, end quote. William Henry and Mark Gray, in their secular research book, Freedom's Gate, Lost Symbols in the U.S. Capitol, add that, quote, the U.S. Capitol has numerous architectural and other features that unquestionably identify it with ancient temples. After listing features to make their case that the U.S. Capitol building is a religious temple, including housing the images of a deified being, heavenly beings, God, symbols, inscriptions, sacred geometry, columns, prayers, orientation to the sun, and so on. They then concluded, quote, the designers of the city of Washington, D.C. oriented it to the sun, especially the rising sun on June 21 and December 21. By the way, the dates in 2020, the Newsweek and other sources reported the Aztec calendar stone in the Capitol Rotunda rolled over to a final age, followed December 21, 2020 by the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn, heralding the arrival of a promised sun that we mentioned earlier. But all that aside, the measurements for this orientation were made from the location of the center of the dome of the U.S. Capitol, rendering it a solar temple. Its alignment and encoded numerology point to the sun as well as to the stars. A golden circle on the rotunda story and a white star in the crypt marks the spot. It is clear that the builders viewed the Capitol as America's sole temple, a solemn solar temple, to be exact, end quote. Now, to understand what those statements may soon mean for the future of the world, one needs to comprehend how these apparati, the dome and the obelisk facing it, actually facilitate important archaic and modern protocols for invigorating prophetic supernatural alchemy. In ancient times, the obelisk represented the god Osiris's missing male organ, which Isis was not able to find after her husband brother was slain and chopped into 14 pieces by his evil brother Seth or Set. The story involves a detailed account of the envious brother Set working with 72 conspirators to trick Osiris into climbing into a box, which Set locked and threw into the Nile. Osiris drowned, and his body floated down the Nile River where it snagged on the limbs of a tamarisk tree. In Byblos, Isis recovered his body from the riverbank and took it into her care, but in her absence, Set stole the body again, and this time he chopped it into 14 pieces, which he threw into the Nile. Isis searched the riverbank until she recovered every piece except for the genitals, which had been swallowed by a fish. Isis recombined the 13 pieces of Osiris that she had found and replaced his missing organ with a magic facsimile, an obelisk, which she then used to impregnate herself during the very first raising of Osiris ceremony, in which she called forth the seed of the dead god from the underworld up through the magic device, thus giving rise to Osiris again in the person of his son, Horus. That legend for reincarnating Osiris literally formed the core of Egyptian cosmology, as well as the Rosicrucian Masonic dying and rising myths, and was fantastically venerated on the most imposing scale throughout all of Egypt by towering obelisks representing the phallus of Osiris and domes representing the pregnant belly of Isis, including at Karnak, where the upright obelisks were vitalized or stimulated from the energy of the masturbatory sun god Ra shining down upon them. Now, in Egypt, where these rituals were performed and perfected to actually raise the spirit of Osiris into the reigning pharaoh, political authority in the form of divine kingship or theocratic statesmanship was established, later reflected in the political and religious doctrine of the divine right of kings, who supposedly derived their rights to rule from the will of God, with the exception that in some countries the king is subject to the church, aka the Pope. But this meant, among other things, that the Egyptian pharaoh enjoyed extraordinary authority as the son of the sun god Ra and the incarnation of the falcon god Horus during his lifetime. Now, at death, Pharaoh would become the Osiris, the divine judge of the netherworld, and on earth, his son and predecessor would take his place as the newly anointed manifestation of Horus, or the reincarnated seed of Osiris. So each generation of pharaohs provided the gods with a spokesman for the present world and for the afterlife, while also offering the nation divinely appointed leadership. The observant listener at this point may be wondering, but was there something more to the pharaoh's deification than faith in ritual magic? The cult center of Amun-Ra at Thebes may actually hold the answer, as it was the site of the largest religious structure ever built, the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, and the location of many extraordinary, mysterious rites. The great temple, with its miles of walls and gardens, was the primary object of fascination, by the way, and worship by the nemesis of Moses, the pharaoh of the Exodus, Ramses II. But this was the place where each pharaoh would reconcile his divinity in the company of Amun-Ra during a festival called Opet. The festival was held at the Temple of Luxor, and it included a procession of gods carried on barges up the Nile River from Karnak to the temple. The royal family would accompany the gods on boats, while the Egyptian laity would walk along the shore, calling aloud and making requests of the gods, and even acting out parts of the ritual and mythology of the Osiris-Isis myth. But once they arrived at Luxor, the pharaoh and his entourage would enter the Holy of Holies, where the ceremony to raise the spirit of Osiris into the king would be performed, and Pharaoh would be transmogrified into a living deity. So as he's standing inside the domed belly of Isis, looking out into the courtyard at the obelisk of Osiris, these Egyptian magicians, which according to the Exodus were very, very powerful, they could mimic almost all of the miracles that Moses performed at the command of God, they would conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony. So the seed of Osiris would be drawn up from out of the underworld through the obelisk in the courtyard, magically emit into the domed belly of Isis where Pharaoh was standing, and that's when he would be changed in that moment. He went in to the dome a man, he walks outside, he is a god, and there he greets a large group of dancers and musicians who had been waiting anxiously. He was born again, Osiris, and the crowd would erupt in gaiety. And from that day forward, the Pharaoh would be considered to be, just as the God ciphered on the Great Seal of the United States, will be the son and spiritual incarnation of the supreme deity. The all-seeing eye of Horus, Apollo, Osiris above the unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal represents that actual event. Fast forward to today, at the inauguration of every American president, while he is standing inside the U.S. Capitol Dome, looking out at the largest obelisk of its kind in the world, across town at the House of the Temple, the modern Egyptian magicians, the Freemasons, simultaneously are conducting the raising of Osiris ceremony to call forth the seed of Osiris Apollo from the underworld through the Washington Monument obelisk, where it magically emits into the U.S. Capitol Dome, where America's new leader is standing there, accepting his role as the living representative of deity. Now, this is being done in anticipation of the day when events are going to surpass parity, and the beast that was and is not shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, Apollo. And they that dwell on earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. For a few adepts of history and secret orders, the DC ritual is deliciously staged, as even the term inaugurate is from the Latin or Roman inauguratio, and refers to the archaic ceremony by which the Roman augurs or soothsayers would approve a king or a ruler or other action through omens as being sanctioned by the god Jupiter, which Thomas Jefferson wanted America dedicated to, the same entity whose prophecies on the Great Seal herald his upcoming challenge to Yahweh Jehovah for heavenly supremacy, while his son, for a while, Apollo Osiris, seizes authority over the world in a final golden pagan age. As pointed out in our best-selling documentary Belly of the Beast and in broadcast programs on Skywatch TV, the dome where U.S. presidents stand during inauguration and where they lie in state for their spirit to rise into the apotheosis overhead to join George Washington in the kingdom of Osiris at death, alone is an unparalleled magical construct that openly hides the most formidable ancient supernaturalism meant for regeneration of Apollo Osiris. In fact, the U.S. Capitol Dome is a satanic antichrist plagiarism of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that I believe is going to play a role in the healing of Antichrist after he experiences a deadly head wound in Revelation 13:3. Note that the 1865 Apotheosis of Washington, which was painted by Greek-Italian artist Costantino Bruniti, is visible through the oculus of the dome in the rotunda. It bears anything but Christian symbols. It is filled with those Greco-Roman gods to whom Thomas Jefferson dedicated the United States. It is called the Apotheosis of Washington, Apotheosis means to become a god or a revived eternal being. In this depiction, Washington is becoming Osiris of the afterlife. The gods in the painting surrounding Washington are depicted helping the founders establish a more perfect union, as in the New Atlantis scheme described elsewhere in my upcoming book, Zeitgeist 2025. Directly beneath the apotheosis are 72 pentagrams forming a sorcerous gateway used by secret society members and occultists to bind and loose the 72 fallen angels that are over the heathen nations. You can learn about that in Psalms 82, Deuteronomy 32, and other research on the divine council. Finally, under that is the floor of the rotunda. And beneath the floor of the rotunda is what is called the U.S. National Crypt, where, yes, an empty tomb resides. He is not there, for he is risen. And this is the very location where I argue Antichrist is going to be taken after his head injury, and the Freemasons will conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony, at which time he's going to be transformed into the living incarnation of Osiris, Apollo. Now, there's a lot more to the Capitol Dome Antichrist plagiarism of the life of Christ and those aspects of the building's design. And for a limited time, we're going to be giving away the Belly of the Beast documentary and other special productions that lay all of this hidden architecture and symbolism out. We're going to be giving that away free with the new book, Zeitgeist 2025, in the Skywatch TV store. But the points of interest clearly reveal how the architects of the U.S. Capitol Dome imagined a dark parody of Jesus, because as Jesus died and rose into heaven, so Washington rises into a heaven to become the Osiris. As the 72 pentagrams in the Capitol Dome are used to control the 72 cosmo craters over the nations, Jesus confronted the 72 fallen watchers from the base of Mount Hermon to his visit in the underworld and final ascension into heaven, whereby he proclaimed in Revelation 1:18, I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, which is a clear denunciation of the Osiris dying and rising myth that was so popular during the first advent of Jesus. Amen, and have the keys of hell, he goes on to say, but he uses there the Greek word Hades, which is the Greek name for Osiris. So think about what's happening there. He says, I am he who was dead and am alive forevermore. I'm the true dying and rising God. And I'm the one who has the keys of hell, Hades, and death. That's important because Osiris at the time of Christ was considered the lord of the underworld in Greek myth, and he controlled who possessed the keys to the 12 gates of the Egyptian afterlife. Much has been written by historians within and without Masonry as to the relevance of the number 72 and the alchemy related to it. In the Kabbalah, Freemasonry, and Jewish apocalyptic writings, for instance, 72 equals the total of wings that Enoch received when he was transformed into the powerful angel Metatron. Now that plays an important role for the Brotherhood, for Masonry, because Metatron is the one that was enabled as the guiding spirit over America during the reign of George W. Bush, whose family, by the way, have contributed millions of dollars to advancing the rights of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And that's acknowledged inside the Hall of Charity within the Herodome where I've been. Bush's administration enabled the angel in the whirlwind, Metatron, to direct the future and fate of the United States, as also was prayed by Congressman Major R. Owens of New York before the House of Representatives on Wednesday, February 28, 2001. But in the context of the Capitol Dome and the 72 stars that encircle Washington's apotheosis in the womb of Isis, the significance of that symbolism is far more important. In sacred literature, including the Bible, stars are symbolic of angels, and And within Masonic Gnosticism, these 72 powerful entities reflected in the 72 conspirators that controlled Osiris's life in Egyptian myth, they currently administer the affairs of earth under Satan, the god of this world, according to 2 Corinthians 4:4. Experts in the study of the divine council believe that, beginning at the Tower of Babel, the world and its inhabitants were disinherited by the sovereign God of Israel and placed under the authority of 72 angels, which became corrupt and disloyal to God in their administration of those nations. Psalms 82. Those beings quickly became worshipped on earth as gods following Babel, led by none other than Nimrod, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo. Consistent within that tradition, the designers of the Capitol Dome, the Great Seal of the United States, and the obelisk, Washington Monument, circled the apotheosis of Washington with 72 pentagram stars. They dedicated the obelisk 72 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and they placed 72 stones on the Great Seal's uncapped pyramid, above which the eyes of Horus, Osiris, Apollo stare from the Great Seal of the United States. Those three sets of 72, combined with the imagery and occult numerology of the Osiris obelisk and the Isis dome and the oracular Great Seal, are symbolic of the influence of Satan, a demonic trinity, and his angels over the world, with a prophecy towards Satan's final earthly empire, the coming Novus Ordo Seclorum, or the new golden pagan age. In order for the inevitable worship of Osiris to be reestablished on earth, these 72 demons that govern the nations have to be controlled. Therefore, they're set in magical constraints on the Great Seal, the Washington obelisk, and the pentagram circles around the apotheosis of Washington in order to bind and force the occultist's desired effect. In The Secret Destiny of America, Hall noted as well that the 72 stones of the pyramid on the Great Seal correspond to the 72 arrangements of the Tetragrammaton, or the four-lettered name of God in Hebrew. He said, quote, "These four letters can be combined in 72 combinations, resulting in what is called the Shinhamphorish, which represents, in turn, the laws, powers, and energies of nature," end quote. Now, the idea that the mystical name of God could be invoked by occultists to bind or loose supernatural agents, or powers and energies of nature, as Hall called them, is meaningful creed within many occult tenets, including Kabbalah and Freemasonry. And this is why the 72 stars are pentagram-shaped around the deified Freemason George Washington. Medieval books of magic, or grimoires, such as the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, not only identify the star systems Orion, which is Osiris, and Pleiades, which is Apollo, as the home of these powers, but applies great importance to the pentagram shape of the stars for binding and loosing their influence. Adept Rosicrucians and Freemasons have been using these magical texts forever, the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, to do just that. Modern people, especially in America, might view the architecture used in this magic, the dome representing the habitually pregnant belly of Isis, and the obelisk representing the erect phallus of Osiris, as profane or pornographic. But in fact, to the occultists, these are ritualized fertility objects, which they and the ancients believed could produce tangible reactions, properties, or manifestations within the material world. The obelisk and dome, as imitations of the deity's male and female reproductive organs, could, through government representation, invoke into existence the being or beings symbolized by them. So through such imitative sex, the dome and obelisk become energy receivers capable of assimilating Ra's essence from the rays of the sun, which in turn draw forth the seed of the underworld Osiris. The seed of the dead deity would, according to the supernaturalism, transmit upward out of the underworld through the base or testes of the obelisk and magically emit from the tower's head into the womb or dome of Isis, where incarnation into the sitting pharaoh or king or president would occur during what Freemasons also call the raising of Osiris ceremony. And in that way, Osiris could be habitually born again, reincarnated as Horus, and constantly direct the spiritual destiny of the nation. Now, let me get to the main point of all of this. Because the book of Revelation depicts a final global political figure called Antichrist, who gains allegiance of the world's religious community through a powerful religious leader called the false prophet, it's not surprising to find that the magical constructs in Washington, D.C., necessary for Apollo-Osiris resurrection are mirrored in the very city where the Apostle John said a global harlot church would lead mankind into subservience to the man of sin, something many conservative Catholics for hundreds and hundreds of years have also believed and written about. Now, to be sure, the 330-ton obelisk in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City is not just any obelisk. It was actually cut from a single block of red granite during the 5th dynasty of Egypt to stand as Osiris's erect phallus at the Temple of the Sun in ancient Heliopolis, or the city of On, as it is called in the Bible, dedicated to Ra, Osiris, and Isis. The obelisk was moved from Heliopolis to the Julian Forum of Alexandria by Emperor Augustus, and later from there by Caligula to Rome to stand at the spine of the Circus, where, under Nero, its excited presence maintained a counter-vigil over countless brutal Christian executions, including the martyrdom of the Apostle Peter, according to some historians. Over 1,500 years following that, Pope Sixtus V ordered hundreds of workmen under celebrated engineer architects Giovanni and Domenico Fontana to move the phallic pillar to the center of St. Peter's Square in Rome. And when the cross was placed on top of the obelisk, as you see it today, in the middle of St. Peter's Square, the Pope marked that occasion by conducting the ancient rite of exorcism against the phallic symbol. This was first scheduled to occur September 14th to coincide with the liturgical feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, and not coincidentally under the zodiacal sign of Virgo, Isis. But the event was delayed until later in the month and fell under the sign of Libra, representing a zenith event for the year. On that morning, a pontifical high mass was held just before the cross was raised from a portable altar to the apex of Baal's shaft, as such phallic towers were also known. While clergy prayed and a choir sang psalms, Pope Sixtus stood facing the obelisk and, extending his hand towards it, announced in Latin, "I exorcise you, creature of stone, in the name of God." Sixtus then cast sanctified water upon the pillar's middle, then its right side, then left, then above, and finally below, to form a cross, followed by, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, Amen." He then crossed himself 3 times and watched as the symbol of Christ was placed atop Osiris's erect phallus. Now, upon strolling from the obelisk in St. Peter's Square to inside the Sistine Chapel, one finds the parallels between Washington and the prophecies of the Great Seal do not stop with the dome design and symbol of Osiris's erect manhood, but the very Cumae Sibyl, whose prophecy about the return of the god Apollo is encoded in the Great Seal of the United States, is prominently depicted inside Catholicism's most celebrated chapel. With all of that in mind, whatever happens between now and 2025, I firmly believe events unfolding around the world today, and especially inside the United States, suggest a very near future in which a man of superior intelligence, wit, charm, and diplomacy is indeed going to emerge on the world scene as a savior. He will seemingly possess transcendent wisdom that enables him to solve problems and to offer solutions for many of today's most perplexing issues. His popularity is going to be widespread. His fans are going to include the young and old, religious and non-religious, male and female. Talk show hosts are going to be interviewing his colleagues. News anchors will be covering his movement. Scholars will be applauding his uncanny ability at resolving what has escaped the rest of us. And the poor will bow down at his table. He is going in all human respects to appeal to the best ideas of society, but his profound comprehension and irresistible presence will be the manifest of an invisible network of thousands of years of collective knowledge. He will quite literally represent the embodiment of that very old super intelligent spirit predicted on the Great Seal in the capital city layout of the United States. As Jesus Christ was the seed of the woman according to Genesis 3:15, this man's going to be the seed of the serpent. Moreover, though his arrival in the form of a man was foretold by numerous scriptures, the broad masses are not going to immediately recognize him for what he actually is: paganism's ultimate incarnation, the beast, Apollo, Osiris of Revelation 13:1 and 17:8. And so I have to ask you something. Are you therefore prepared spiritually, mentally, and physically for what is just ahead? Ancient and modern occultists obviously have plans for the near future, including strategies to install the dreaded man of sin who will, for a short period of time, conquer and then betray the human race. Thankfully, it's the true Father of heaven and his Son, Jesus Christ, that are going to have the final word and ultimately determine the fate of mankind. Therefore, knowing Jesus as Savior is the first, most important emergency planning step you can take for your future security and survival. With Christ as your Lord, you'll be able to enter thou into thy chambers and shut thy doors about thee and hide thyself, as it were, for a little moment, until the indignation be overpast, according to Isaiah 26:20.